The lake house always smelled like citronella and money, and my stepmother liked it that way. She had strung the deck with 200 little white lights, hired a caterer she would mention 4 times before dessert, and put on the silver bracelet she saved for nights she wanted to be looked at. It was her 35th anniversary with my father. 40 guests stood around the long tables in the blue end of the evening, holding sweating glasses, waiting to be told when to be impressed. Somewhere out on the water, a boat idled and went quiet. The band she had hired was between songs. It was, by every measure Lynette cared about, a perfect night. I had driven 6 hours to be there. I stood near the deck rail with a club soda, wearing a plain navy dress and flat shoes, my hair down for once instead of pinned up tight, and I let the party happen around me the way I always did. I had learned a long time ago that the safest place at Lynette's parties was the edge of them. From the edge you can see the whole floor. From the edge you can watch a room the way I had been trained to watch rooms, cataloging the exits and the tension and the one person who was standing wrong. That night the person standing wrong was me, and I knew it, and I had made my peace with it before I ever got in the car. She tapped her glass with a ring, and the sound carried the way she wanted it to. People turned. She smiled the smile she used on strangers, wide and certain, and she thanked everyone for coming, and she said a few warm things about my father that made the older women put their hands to their chests. Then her eyes traveled across the deck and found me at the rail, and the smile changed into something she liked a great deal better. "Before I forget," she said, loud enough for the dock, "a little housekeeping. Don't leave your things around Vivian tonight." A few people laughed, thinking it was a joke. She let them think it, and she let the laugh build before she went on. "I mean it," she said. "She steals, always has. My own husband won't say it, so I will. We all count our cash after she visits." She lifted her glass toward me like a toast, and her voice went sweet and cruel at the very same time. "Family." A dozen guests laughed for real this time. Somebody said, "Lynette," in the delighted, scandalized way people say a name when they want more of exactly this. A woman I had met twice pressed her napkin to her mouth to keep from grinning. My father, Gordon, stood beside my stepmother with his drink held against his chest and looked down at the floorboards. He did not say anything. He had not said anything in 20 years, and I had long since stopped waiting for the night he would. I set my club soda down on the rail. I did not argue. I had stopped arguing in 2012. I looked at my stepmother and I let the silence sit there between us, because I had spent an entire career learning that silence is a tool and not a wound, and because there was nothing I could say in that room that the room actually wanted to hear. A woman who is enjoying being cruel is not looking for a defense. She is looking for a reaction. I have made a professional habit, across many years and many rooms, of not giving people the reaction they are hunting for. What I could not tell them was that at that exact moment, 90 miles away, a duty officer was reading a message that would end this party for me before the cake was ever cut. I did not know it yet either, but down at the foot of the long gravel driveway, headlights I would have recognized anywhere were turning in off the county road, moving slow and deliberate, and 2 doors were about to open, and the smaller story my family had told about me for 20 years had roughly 4 minutes left to live. I want to back up, because the accusation is not really the point. The point is the 20 years of quiet that made the accusation possible in the first place. My name is Vivian Larkin. In that family, I was the daughter who never settled, the one who moved every couple of years, who could not seem to hold anything down, who showed up to holidays without a husband or a house or a good clean answer to the question of what exactly it was that she did for a living. I let them believe all of it, every single word. I want you to understand that I was not a victim of that story. I was, for 20 years, its most careful and deliberate author. What I actually did was command a joint task force. I was a colonel in the United States Army Military Police Corps, 22 years in that October. The work itself was not glamorous, whatever the word colonel makes people picture. For 9 of those years I had done protective services, which is the unglamorous science of standing between important people and the small number of human beings who mean them harm. And it is mostly patience and paperwork and rehearsing bad days that never come. I had run details in 2 war zones and in 3 cities that were supposed to be safe. I had learned to walk into a reception and know inside 10 seconds where every door led and which guest was sweating for the wrong reason. My current command touched the protection of people and places that most of that deck could not have found on a map, and a good part of it lived behind a security clearance that did not care about anniversaries or feelings. When my stepmother said I could not hold a job, I had, that same week, signed for the accountability of several hundred soldiers, and a mission that did not stop when I stepped away from it. When she said I drifted, the truth was that I had moved 11 times in 20 years because the Army told me to move, and Sarah and I had never once, not one single time, missed a report date. I brought all of it to every one of Lynette's parties, and I was never once able to use any of it, and it sat inside me unused, like a language spoken fluently in a country that has never heard of it. There is a thing that happens to people who spend their careers being the calm one in dangerous rooms. You get very good at reading everyone, and very bad at being read. I could tell you which man at a gas station was carrying and did not want to be, which car had circled the block one time too many, which smiling stranger at a reception had a reason to be nervous that the rest of the room had not caught yet. I had used that skill to keep alive people who never once learned my name. And then I would fly home and sit at a table where the greatest threat in the room was my stepmother's opinion of me. And I would read it coming from all the way across the yard, and I would do the one thing all that training was good for in that setting, which was nothing at all. I would let it land. I would keep my face still. There is no medal for the operations you run against your own instinct to defend yourself, but those were some of the hardest ones I ever ran. None of that was sayable. Some of it was classified outright. The rest would have sounded like a lie because a woman who supposedly cannot hold a job does not turn out to run a task force. People believe the story they started with, and they defend it harder the longer they have held it, and my family had held theirs for 2 decades. I understood that better than they did. Reading which story a room has already decided to believe is the first thing you learn when your job depends on finding the one person in a crowd who does not belong there. So I let them fill my silence with the worst thing they could imagine, which was a thief, and I carried the weight of the true thing alone, because the true thing had a name inside it that I loved too much to say out loud. I moved through that party the way I moved through everything, which was quietly and usefully. When a young caterer struggled with a tray of glasses at the top of the deck stairs, I took one end of it without being asked, and we carried it inside together, and she thanked me, and I told her the shrimp was excellent, which it was. Lynette watched me do it, and I saw her file it away behind her eyes. Help, not family. The girl who is comfortable with the staff because she is barely a step above them. Every kindness I performed became, in her private ledger, more evidence for a case she had already decided she had won. I caught my own reflection in the dark glass of the sliding door on the way back out. Plain dress, flat shoes, hair loose around a face that was 44 and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I looked like exactly what they thought I was. It is a strange thing to stand in a room wearing an entire life that not one person present can see. I had gotten very good at it over the years. You learn to hold 2 completely different sizes of a life inside the same body, and to let the smaller one be the only one anybody ever sees. And after enough years, the holding stops feeling like lying and starts feeling simply like manners. The wound was much older than the accusation, and to understand the accusation, you have to go back to a hospital room in the autumn of 2001. My mother, Colleen, died in the October I was 19. She was sick for a year before that, and in that year I learned how to run a household while pretending to everyone, including her, that everything was fine, which turns out to be excellent early training for the rest of my life. I paid the bills that year. I answered the door for the casseroles. I learned the phone voice you use with the insurance company, calm and specific and impossible to brush off. My father fell apart quietly and almost completely. He was a good man made of soft materials, and when she went, something inside him sat down and did not get back up for a long time. I became the steady one by default because someone had to be, and I was the one standing closest when the job came open. I remember one night that winter, maybe 3 weeks after the funeral, finding my father sitting in the dark at the kitchen table with the bills spread out in front of him, and not one of them opened. He was not crying. He was just looking at them, the way you look at a language you used to be able to read. I made coffee that neither of us drank, and I opened the envelopes one at a time, and I sorted them into what was urgent and what could wait, and I wrote the checks and slid them across for him to sign, and he signed them without looking. That was the first night I understood that being the strong one is mostly just being the one who is willing to open the envelope. It is not a gift. It is a decision you make in a dark kitchen, and then you keep making it, and eventually the people around you forget you ever had a choice. And after a while, so do you. My mother told me one thing near the very end that I have kept for 25 years. She said that you can carry a thing quietly and still be carrying it. She meant grief. She meant that I did not have to perform my sadness for it to be real, that a private ache weighs exactly the same as a loud one. I took it, the way children take the last things their parents say to them, and I applied it to everything for the rest of my life, sometimes more wisely than others. 8 years later, my father married Lynette Farrow, and I was glad, genuinely glad, because he had been alone for a long time and she made him laugh, and a laughing father was worth a great deal to me after all those years of watching him grieve. Lynette came into our lives with a grown son named Brett, 21 at the time, easy and funny, and always, somehow, a little short on cash. I liked him at first. Almost everybody liked Brett at first. That, as it turned out, was the entire problem with Brett. The label got fixed onto me at Christmas of 2012, and I can still walk through that kitchen in my mind. An envelope of cash went missing from the drawer by the phone. $400 my father kept there for the man who plowed the driveway. Lynette found it gone the morning after the party, and her eyes went around the family and stopped on me, because I was the one who had been between postings that winter, the one whose life did not add up on paper, the one who had shown up quiet and left early and slept in the spare room down the hall from that very kitchen. "It is always the same when you visit," she said, standing there in her robe with the empty drawer open. And my father looked at the floor, and the guests who were still around for coffee found sudden reasons to study their cups. And I understood, in one clean and terrible second, exactly where that money had actually gone. Because I had watched Brett work the room all through the party the night before. I read people counting exits for a living. I had watched him count that kitchen. I could have said it right then. I had, in effect, the receipt in my hand. But my father had buried a wife, and had only just, after 8 hard years, stopped sitting down inside himself. And the price of my innocence in that moment was blowing his new marriage apart over $400 and a stepson's ugly little problem. So I did the arithmetic that I would go on doing for the next 12 years. I decided that the truth cost more than the silence. And I paid the silence, and I said nothing. And I let the drawer close on me. It was not only the $400, and it was not only that one Christmas. Over the 12 years that followed, small amounts went missing at a slow and careful pace. A folded bill from a purse. A check that never cleared the way it should have. The cash from a graduation card. A watch my father finally decided he must have simply misplaced. Each time, if I was visiting, Lynette's eyes found me, and if I was not, the loss got written off to bad luck and old age and forgetting. Each time I traced it quietly, because once you learn how to follow money, you cannot unlearn it, and each time it led to the same place, and each time I made the same cold decision and made the family whole again out of my own account. I want to be honest about the pride that was tangled up in all of it, because it was not pure, noble sacrifice, and I have had a long time now to look at it squarely. Some of it was a cold and private satisfaction in being the only adult in the room who could see the entire board and choose, deliberately, not to flip it. I told myself for years that this was strength, that carrying it in silence made me the strong one. It took me a very long time to understand how much of it was just another way of staying bent, of making a virtue out of a spine that had forgotten how to straighten. The headlights I recognized belonged to a black SUV, and the 2 men who got out of it were not agents in the way the movies mean the word, but they were mine, and their arrival that night was not a performance staged for anybody. I need to be very clear about that because a great many people assumed afterward that I had arranged the whole thing, that I had called in a favor just to embarrass my stepmother in her own house. I had done nothing of the kind. That morning, my task force had raised its protective posture in response to a specific and credible threat directed at its leadership, which on that particular week meant me. My protective detail had been reattached for the first time in months. I had told them where I would be that weekend because that is simply the rule when you are covered, and I had honestly believed I would eat one polite piece of anniversary cake, make my excuses, and drive the 6 hours home without ever seeing either of them. The taller of the two came up the deck stairs without hurrying and without any apology, which is its own kind of announcement to anyone who knows how to hear it. He was Sergeant First Class Aaron Vance, 37 years old, and he had spent 9 years learning to move through a crowd the way weather moves through a valley, quietly and completely and without ever asking permission. He crossed the deck and found me at the rail. He did not look at Lynette, who was still mid-sentence, still telling the guests something warm and self-satisfied about my father. Vance put himself at my right shoulder, angled outward toward the crowd, and he spoke at the exact volume you use when only one person is meant to hear the words. "Colonel Larkin," he said, "we need to move, now." He held out a secure handset in one flat hand. "Colonel Nadar is holding for you, ma'am." I have been called Colonel by thousands of people over the years. I had never once been called it on that deck, in that house, in front of that family. The word landed in that soft party space, like a stone dropped into a still pond, and I watched the rings begin to travel out across the crowd, face by face as people who had been laughing 4 seconds earlier tried to reconcile the sound of it with the woman they thought they knew. A woman near the punch bowl said, not quietly enough, that there must be some kind of mistake. A man I did not know laughed once and then stopped when nobody joined him. The band, which had just started up again, trailed off a second time, and this time nobody told them to keep playing. The second agent at the foot of the stairs had not moved and had not spoken, and somehow his stillness was doing more work on that crowd than any announcement could have done. People do not know exactly what they are looking at when they see a protective detail, but their bodies know. Their bodies go quiet the way animals go quiet when the quality of the light changes. Near the tables, one older guest went very still. I had noticed him earlier in the evening, a big quiet man named Harlan Beck, who lived 2 docks down, 68 or so, the kind of retired man who watches a great deal more than he ever says. He was reading the handset and the earpiece and the specific way Vance was standing, and his face had changed the way a face changes when it hears a language it used to speak fluently and has not heard spoken aloud in years. He leaned toward my stepmother, who was still holding her wineglass, still smiling, still not understanding a thing, and he said the only entirely true sentence anyone said in that first long minute. "Lynette," he said, low and even, "you really don't know who she is?" I lifted the handset to my ear. "Larkin," I said, and my voice came out of me in the register I keep for work, low and flat and stripped of every ounce of the party, and 40 people who had never met that voice heard a stranger use my body to speak. For the next several minutes I lived in 2 places at once, and both of them wanted the whole of me, and I could give my full attention to only one. In my ear, Lieutenant Colonel Priya Nadar, my deputy, was laying out the situation in the clipped shorthand the 2 of us used when time was the enemy. A planning window that we had assessed as days had collapsed into hours. The threat timeline had compressed, hard, and there was a decision in front of us that only the commander was authorized to make, and she needed it from me before the next hour turned over. "Ma'am," she said, and I could hear the operations floor behind her, the low, steady noise of people doing serious work. "They moved it up. I need your call, and I need you inside a secure facility, not standing on a deck somewhere. How fast can you be moving?" I told her 20 minutes to a secure line, and I gave her the interim guidance she needed to act on until I got there, and she read it back to me, clean and exact. That small, ordinary exchange, 2 officers doing their jobs at the top of their competence, was the most steadying thing I had felt in hours. There is a version of me that only exists on that kind of call, and the family had never met her, and she was walking out onto that deck now, whether any of them were ready for her or not. I need you to understand what it costs to split yourself like that, because it is the whole shape of the night. Half of me was standing on a lake house deck, being called a liar by a woman in a silver bracelet. The other half was 90 miles away in a windowless room, holding the safety of people I would never meet inside a decision I had about 90 seconds to make correctly. You do not get to feel the insult while you are doing that. There is no room left in you for it. The insult has to wait in line behind the work, and by the time the work is finished, the insult has usually lost most of its power because you have just been reminded, hard, of the actual scale of things. My stepmother thought she was landing the blow of the evening. She did not know she was competing with a genuine emergency for my attention, and she did not know that she was losing. On the deck itself, my stepmother was losing control of a night she had never once, in 35 years of throwing parties, imagined she could lose control of. She could see the guests looking at me with something new in their faces, and she did not like it, and she did not understand it. And so she reached for the old familiar story with both hands, the way you grab for a railing in the dark. "This is a show," she said, and not quietly now. This is exactly the kind of things she does. She has to make everything about herself. She cannot stand for one single evening not to be the center of it. There was a thin crack running through her voice now that had not been there a minute before. "Gordon, tell her to stop it." My father did not tell me to stop anything. My father was staring at Sergeant First Class Vance's earpiece, and at the second man who now stood easy at the bottom of the deck stairs, with his hands folded loosely in front of him and his eyes moving across the yard, and I watched something move behind my father's face that I had not seen, aimed at me in a very long time. It was the specific fear a parent feels when they realize, far too late, that their child has been standing in a fire the parent never once noticed. Calm the whole time, saying nothing, because the child did not want them to worry. At the edge of the deck, half in the shadow by the drink table, my stepbrother Brett had gone the exact color of paper. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the SUV in the driveway, and then at Vance, and then back at the SUV. Brett, of all the people standing on that deck, understood precisely what a protective detail meant, because Brett had spent his entire adult life reading rooms for the nearest exit. And he knew in his gut that whatever I was not the small and harmless thing his mother had spent 12 years telling everyone I was. And if I was not the small thing, then a very large and very old question was about to be asked, in front of everyone, about where all that missing money had actually been going. I held up one finger to Lynette, not rudely, just the way you tell a room to wait. Then I turned my back on the entire party, on the lights and the laughing and the wine glasses, and I gave Priya Nader 3 orders in roughly 40 seconds, precise and complete, and I handed the handset back to Vance. When I turned around again, the deck was silent in a way that Lynette's parties, in all the years I had been forced to attend them, had never once been silent. I had rehearsed the night the truth came out. I had rehearsed it for years, honestly, in airports and in the back seats of vehicles and in the long, empty hours that command hands you, whether you want them or not. And in every single version I had ever built in my head, I said the thing. I laid the receipts out on the table in front of everyone. I watched Lynette's certain face come apart, and I felt the cold, clean satisfaction of justice arriving exactly on schedule. And my father finally understood what his daughter had been carrying. And I walked out of that house, vindicated and upright and free. Standing there on the deck with the whole party looking at me, with my detail waiting and a real crisis running in another county, I understood all at once that I was not going to do a single part of it. Not that night, and not like that, and maybe not ever, the way I had imagined it. Part of the reason was simple and practical. I did not have the time. I had a job to go and do, an actual one with actual people whose safety did not care in the slightest about the state of my family. But part of it was something I had genuinely not planned for, and it caught me off guard standing right there. I looked at Brett's paper-white face by the drink table, and I saw a man who was already falling, who did not need me to reach over and push him off the ledge in front of 40 people, whose mother was about to lose 2 children in a single night if I said out loud everything that I had every right to say. And then I looked at Lynette, whose certainty about me was very nearly the only architecture holding her upright as a person, and I found, to my own real surprise, that I did not want to be the one who knocked it out from under her in public. I had spent 12 years believing, without ever seriously questioning it, that my stepmother was simply a cruel woman. Standing on that deck, watching her reach for the old story with a crack in her voice, I began to wonder for the first time whether she had not been cruel at all, but only wrong. Which is a different thing, and a much sadder one. A cruel person knows the truth and chooses the knife anyway. A wrong person believes, with her whole heart, that the knife is justice. I did not know yet which of the two she was. But I decided in the space of that one breath that whatever she turned out to be, the finding of it out could happen quietly, later, aimed at one person across a kitchen table instead of 40 people on a deck. So I made 2 decisions in about the length of a single slow breath. I would leave and go do my job, and I would not use this night as a weapon against anyone, no matter how thoroughly they had earned it, and no matter how long I had waited. I have thought a great deal since about why the mercy felt less like a gift I was giving and more like a door I was quietly closing behind me. I think it is this. Revenge would have kept them all at the very center of my story for another 20 years. It would have meant that the single most important thing I ever did in that house was finally win an argument with my stepmother. I did not want them at the center of my story anymore. I had a whole life that was actually mine, waiting in a car in the driveway. And the fastest way back to it was not through them. It was straight past them. There is an old idea in my line of work that you do not clear a room by making noise in it. You clear it by making the noise stop mattering. For 20 years, my family's version of me had been the loudest thing in every room I entered, and I had tried in 100 small ways to argue it quieter, and none of it had ever worked, because you cannot argue a person out of a story that is doing a job for them. What finally cleared the room was not an argument at all. It was a black vehicle in the driveway and 2 men who never once raised their voices. The story did not lose because I beat it. It lost because something truer walked in and stood next to it. And the 2 of them could not occupy the same space. And every person in that room could see, without being told, which of the 2 was real. I crossed the deck to my father. I put my hand on his arm, the same arm I had held at my mother's grave when I was 19, and he could not stand up straight. "Dad," I said quietly, just for him. "I have to go. It is work, and it is real, and I cannot explain it to you. And I need you to trust me for a few hours the way I have always trusted you." I held his eyes. "I love you. Everything else can wait. It has waited this long." His mouth opened and nothing at all came out of it. I picked up my bag from where I had tucked it under the rail. Vance was already turning, already reading the crowd, already opening a clean lane through the guests toward the stairs, the way running water finds the low ground without being told where it is. What happened next was not a speech, and that is the part that people who hear this story never quite believe. There was no grand moment where I turned and announced my rank to the crowd and watched them gasp. The reckoning was far quieter than that, and it was far bigger than that, and it happened almost entirely without any help from me at all. It happened because 40 people stood on a deck and watched 2 calm, unhurried, deeply professional men treat the family thief as a person to be protected. It happened because Sergeant First Class Vance moved me through that party with the specific and unmistakable care that a detail gives a principal. 1 man ahead of me and 1 man trailing, both of them watching everything in that yard. That was not me. You cannot fake that, and you cannot mistake it for anything else once you have seen it done in earnest. Every person on that deck had watched it 100 times on a screen, and not one of them had ever seen it in their own backyard, aimed at a woman they had personally laughed at 90 seconds before. And it happened because of Harlan Beck. As I came down the deck toward the stairs, the big quiet man from 2 docks down straightened up off the railing he had been leaning on, and he came to attention. He did it the way old soldiers do it, without any drama at all, almost privately, a body simply remembering a thing it had once owed and owed again. He did not salute, because we were both standing there in civilian clothes, and he knew better than that. He just stood the way you stand, heels together, eyes level, and he held it as I passed him, and he gave me 1 small nod that carried 30 years of a life inside it. I learned later that he had retired a command sergeant major after a full career. In that moment, I only knew that exactly 1 person in that entire crowd had read me correctly, and that his quiet respect was somehow the loudest thing on the whole deck, precisely because he made no noise with it at all. I felt the label break. I did not so much see it happen as feel the pressure in the air change, the way you feel a door open somewhere else in a house without hearing it. The story of Vivian the thief simply could not survive the sight of Vivian being guarded. It could not hold up under the weight of it. 20 years of a smaller, meaner story came apart in the time it took me to walk 40 feet across a wooden deck and down 4 steps to a waiting car, and no one had to say a single word for it to happen, least of all me. I want to describe the walk itself, because it was only 40 feet, and it was somehow the longest and the shortest walk of my life at the same time. The guests moved back without being asked. That is the detail I keep. Nobody told them to. Vance did not touch anyone. People simply read the two men and the way they moved and stepped aside the way a crowd steps aside for something it has decided, all at once and without any discussion, that it should not be standing in front of. Faces I had known for 20 years went by me on both sides, and every one of them was rearranging itself in real time, trying to fit the woman being guarded into the frame they had built for the woman who steals. A cousin whispered my name like a question. A neighbor said, "Oh, softly, the way you say it when a thing finally makes sense." My stepmother had gone completely silent. I did not look at her as I passed. I had spent 20 years being looked at by her and not once being seen, and I found, walking those 40 feet, that I no longer needed to check whether she was watching. I did not handle the family truth that night. I handled the crisis. It took most of the following 12 hours, and it is not mine to describe to you, except to say that it ended the way we had needed it to end, and that not one of the people who were protected that night ever knew how close a thing it had actually been. That is the whole job, most of the time. You stand between people and a danger they will never learn the size of, and then you go home, and nobody thanks you, because nobody knew. I will tell you the one thing about that night I am allowed to tell you, which is how it felt, because a feeling is not classified. It felt like being exactly where I had been built to be. Every year of the 11 moves, every school, every deployment, every long, unglamorous rotation of standing a post while other people slept. All of it had been quietly assembling the person who could sit in a windowless room and make those calls without her hands shaking. My family had spent 20 years grieving a daughter who never amounted to anything. The daughter they were grieving was, that very night, the reason a number of people woke up the next morning and drove their children to ordinary places and never once knew how close the morning had come to not arriving. I did not need them to know it. That is the strange gift the work gives you. It hands you a version of your own worth that does not require a single witness. You carry the proof of it around inside your own certainty, and no toast and no drawer full of missing money and no silver bracelet raised in the shape of a kindness can touch it, because it was never built out of what anyone else believed about you. It was built out of what you actually did, in rooms they will never see, on nights they will never hear about. I drove back out to the lake house the next day, alone this time, with a plain manila folder on the passenger seat beside me that I had spent 12 years quietly hoping I would never once have to open. I drove the county road with the windows down, and I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt the specific flat calm that comes after a long operation when the adrenaline has burned all the way off and left only the arithmetic of what has to happen next. The reveal that people love to imagine, the gasp, the room turning, I had walked straight through the middle of it and barely felt it, because I had been on a phone the entire time doing the actual work. That is the truth about most reckonings. They arrive while you're busy with something more important, and they are quieter than the version in your head, and then they are simply over. The party was long over by the time I got there. The 200 little white lights were still strung up, gray and meaningless now in the flat noon daylight, and the caterers' tables were gone, and the house had the particular stillness of a place that has held far too much the night before, and has not yet decided what to do with any of it. Lynette was out on the deck alone, with a cup of coffee. She was not drinking. When she saw my car in the drive, she stood up too fast, and her chair scraped, and she caught it before it went over. I did not raise my voice. I never do. I have found across a whole career that the quietest voice in a room is very often the one people lean in the hardest to hear. I sat down across the table from her, and I set the folder down on the wood between us, and I told her the truth in order, without heat, in the flat, even way you deliver a briefing to someone who very much does not want to receive it. I told her that the money which had gone missing from her house at her parties for 12 years had gone, all of it, every last dollar, to her son. I told her about Brett's debts, the ones I had first traced in that Christmas of 2012, and had never afterward stopped tracing. I told her that I had been quietly paying it back, a little at a time, into my father's accounts and around the soft edges of the family finances, for over a decade, so that the household never once came up short, and so that my father never had to learn that the boy he had grown to love as his own was slowly hollowing them both out. I opened the folder. I did not make her read it. I only let her see that it was real, that it was 12 years thick, a paper trail I had built not to accuse her, but to protect every last one of them from a truth I had been certain would break my father's heart for the second time in his life. I have been paying it back for 12 years, Lynette, I said. I did it so that Dad would never have to know. I let you think it was me all this time because the alternative was so much worse for him than it was for me. I need you to understand that I did not come out here to have this conversation, and I did not want it. I am only having it now because last night you made the lie load-bearing. You built your whole toast on it, and I will not stand by and let my father spend another 20 years standing on something that will not hold his weight. She did not argue with me, and it was that, more than anything else, that told me at last that I had been wrong about her all these years. A genuinely cruel woman would have found an angle even then, would have gone looking for the crack in my story or the reason it was still somehow my fault. Lynette did none of that. She just looked at the open folder, and then she looked up at me, and her entire careful architecture came down in her face all at once, all 12 years of it, and she had absolutely nothing to say. Because for the first time in a very long time, she was looking straight at the actual shape of her own life, instead of at the comfortable story she had been telling herself about it. The fallout was not clean. Real things almost never are, and I had stopped expecting them to be a long time ago. Lynette called Brett out to the house that same afternoon, and I left before she did it, because there are some reckonings that should not have an audience. And the very last person who should be sitting in that room is the one who spent 12 years wearing the blame for it. I do not know everything that passed between them. I know that it went on for a long time, that voices rose and then fell and then rose again through the open windows as I pulled away. I know that it was, whatever else it was, the first genuinely honest conversation the two of them had had in years, and that the gambling and the debts and the long, steady trickle of small thefts all came apart in it at once, in a single afternoon after so long buried. I know that Brett did not deny it in the end. Whatever else my stepbrother was, he was tired, and tired people eventually stop lying, because at some point the lie becomes heavier to hold up than the shame it was built to hide. Later, my sister told me one thing from that afternoon that has stayed with me. She said that at the very end of it, when it was all finally out, Brett had asked his mother why she had never once suspected him, and that Lynette had not been able to answer, and that the not being able to answer was worse for her than anything I could have said on the deck, because the honest answer was that she had needed a thief who was not her son, and I had been standing right there the whole time, convenient and quiet and easy to blame, for 20 years. I did not take any satisfaction in that. I had thought that I would. I had imagined this exact reckoning 100 times and assumed it would taste like winning. It tasted instead like watching a house you used to live in come down, which is to say it tasted like nothing you would ever choose. My father found me on the dark deck that evening, after the worst of it had moved inside and gone quiet. The lake was flat and black and holding the very last of the light. He sat down next to me, the way he used to when I was small, close, with his shoulder near mine and no particular plan for what he was going to say. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why did you let them say it?" "All those years, Vivi." His voice was not angry. It was wrecked, worn all the way through. "You let your own family stand in this house and call you a thief." I thought for a moment about how a person is supposed to answer a question with 12 years folded up inside it. "Because you had already buried Mom," I said, "and it took you 8 years to stop sitting down inside yourself after that, and I was not going to be the one who put you back on the floor. I could carry it, and you could not. So I carried it." I looked out at the water instead of at him. "And because I was proud, Dad, I am not going to sit here and pretend that I was not. There was a part of me that liked being the only one in the family who could see the whole truth and still choose to hold my tongue. That was not your fault, and it was not Lynette's. That part was mine, and I have had to own it." He put his hand over his eyes, and he cried the way old men cry, without very much sound to it, his shoulders going once, and then still. I did not try to fix it. There was nothing left in it to fix. There was only the truth, finally sitting out in the open air between us after all those years. At one point, he asked me what my rank actually meant in plain words, and I told him, plainly, and he was quiet. And then he said that my mother would have known what to do with a daughter like me, and that he never had. I told him that was not true, that he had taught me the one thing that mattered most, which was how to keep standing when the person beside you cannot. He did not answer that. He just reached over in the dark and held my hand the way you hold a rope, and we watched the water until the cold came up off it and drove us both inside. I paid a real price for the silence, and I want to name it plainly because we do not talk nearly enough about what the quiet ones actually spend to stay quiet. I stood down from the crisis 2 days later, back in a hotel near my headquarters, and I unwound the way you unwind after you have held a line for a long time, which is slowly and alone, and mostly in the dark. And in that hotel room, with the work at last set down and the door double locked behind me, I let myself feel a thing that I had not once let myself feel in front of a single member of my family in 20 years. I let myself feel tired. Not sleepy. Tired down in the structure of me, in the load-bearing parts. It is the particular and specific exhaustion of having agreed to be someone's villain for 2 decades, so that somebody else could go on keeping a peace that was never real to begin with. Being believed in the end did not give me back the 20 years. That is the part the good, clean stories always leave out. The truth coming into the light did not rewind a single day of it. It only stopped the meter that had been running the whole time. There is no ceremony for the quiet return of a reputation. Nobody hands it back to you across a table. It simply, slowly, becomes possible again, one careful relationship at a time, to be actually known by the people who had spent so long knowing a stranger they invented and gave your name. My sister Renee called me late that night. She's 4 years younger than I am, and she had spent the whole long season of that family at a careful, self-protective distance from all of it. Never quite in the room when the hard things were being said. She was quiet on the line for a good while, and then she said, "I think I always knew it wasn't you, Viv." And there it was, laid out plain. Not only Lynette's honest wrong belief, but Renee's careful decades of silence, and my father's studying of the floorboards, and my own proud, useful, self-satisfied tongue. It had taken every one of us, working together without ever once discussing it out loud, to build and maintain a lie that size. No one ever holds a false story up entirely alone. There's always a whole room full of people who find it just a little easier to let it go on standing than to be the one who finally pulls it down. I did not blame Renee for any of it. I had done the very same thing myself, for a different reason and with a better excuse, but the same thing all the same. I told her that I loved her, and I meant it, and after we hung up, I lay there in the dark of that hotel room and let the tiredness finally have me for one whole night, which was, when I really think about it, the most honest thing I had done inside that family in a very long time. In the morning, I put the uniform back on, and something in me settled the instant I did, the way a tool settles into a hand that knows it. I looked at myself in the mirror in the actual clothes of my actual life, and I understood that this was the reflection the sliding glass door at the lake house had been trying to show me all along. I thought a great deal that week about the word invisible, and about how wrong it is for what actually happens. I was never invisible. They saw me constantly. They saw a woman and built a whole person out of the parts of her that were easy to explain, and then they mistook their own construction for the truth, and they defended it for 2 decades against every bit of evidence my actual life offered. That is not invisibility. That is being seen badly, on purpose, because seeing you well would have required someone to change their mind about something. I have come to believe that is the more common form of loneliness, and the quieter one. Not being unseen. Being seen wrong by people who have decided they are done looking. If you know that particular ache, I am sorry, and I am also here to tell you that it can end, though rarely on the schedule you would choose. And almost never because you finally found the right words. It ends when the truth simply gets too large to argue with. Your only job in the meantime is to keep being true, so that when the moment finally comes, there is something solid standing there for the light to land on. I did not get a fairy tale out of it, and I would not have trusted one if it had shown up at my door. Lynette asked to meet me a few weeks later, in daylight, at a diner set roughly halfway between her life and mine. She looked older when she came in than she had looked on the deck. She had spent 35 years being certain about things, and she had run all the way out of it at once, and certainty, as it turns out, was a great deal of what had been holding her upright as a person all that time. She did not make excuses when she sat down. She told me plainly that she had believed it, truly and completely believed it, and that Brett had spent years feeding her small, careful doubts about me, one at a time, until the belief had come to feel like her own idea rather than something he had planted. She told me that she had never once let herself go and check it. Not really, because the version of the world in which I was the thief was so much easier to live inside than the version in which her only son was. She said she was sorry, and she let the word sit there without dressing it up. And then she said the thing that I have kept. I spent 20 years counting my cash, she said, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table and not looking up from it. I never once thought to count you. I did not tell her that it was all right, because it was not all right, and to her credit, she did not ask me to say that it was. We did not become close after that. I want to be honest about that, too. We became honest with each other, which at our age and after all of it is worth a good deal more than close, and it lasts longer. Brett went into a program that fall. He is doing the work of it, or he is not, and either way it is finally his to do now, and not mine to carry for him in the dark. My father and I started over, slowly and carefully, the way you rebuild an old dock that a hard winter has half taken, one plank at a time, in whatever good season you are given to do it in. And I went back to the task force, back to the role that had always quietly been mine the entire time, back to the soldiers and the mission, and the plain, unglamorous daily competence of a whole life that not one person at that party had ever been able to see. The task force did not care that I had been, briefly, the most talked about person at a lake house in the upper Midwest. The task force cared that I showed up, that I made the calls, that the soldiers were led and the mission held. That indifference was a mercy of its own. There is a great cleanliness in work that measures you only by what you actually do, after so many years of being measured by a story you were never allowed to tell. It felt lighter than it had in years. I had genuinely not understood how much the secret had weighed until the day I finally set it down. I keep a photograph of my mother on my desk now. The one from before she was sick, when she was laughing at something just outside the frame. Some mornings I look at it before the day starts, and I hear her telling me again that you can carry a thing quietly and still be carrying it. She was right about that, the way she was right about most things. She just never got the chance to tell me the other half of it, which is that you are also, at some point, allowed to put the thing down. My father calls me on Sunday nights now. He did not used to. He asks me about the soldiers, not by name because he knows I cannot, but he asks and he listens, and sometimes he tells me that he is proud of me, plainly, the way he could never quite manage when there was a whole false story standing in the room between us. It is not everything. 20 years is 20 years, and no phone call gives them back. But a man who spent most of my life looking at the floor now looks at me when he talks to me, and I have decided that this is not a small thing. It is, in fact, most of what I was ever really after, underneath all the rest of it. Not to win, just to be looked at by the people I love and actually seen. I want to talk to you now, directly, if you have stayed with me all the way to here, because I suspect that some of you know exactly what that deck felt like under my feet. If you have ever let people believe a smaller story about you in order to keep the peace, then hear me. If you have swallowed a label whole because the truth would have cost someone you love more than the lie ever cost you, then I understand the arithmetic you did, because I did it every day for 20 years. I am not going to stand here and tell you that you were wrong to do it, because sometimes quietly protecting the people you love is very nearly the whole job of a decent life, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I am going to tell you the one thing I learned for certain, standing on that deck while two quiet men opened a clean path through a crowd that had been laughing at me only a moment before. Your dignity was never theirs to give back to you. It was always yours, the entire time sitting exactly where you left it. They can be wrong about you for 20 years, and it does not change one single thing about who you actually are underneath their story. The recognition is a fine thing when it finally comes around. It is not the point, and it never was. The point is that you knew, the whole time, alone, in the dark, carrying it, that you were someone worth a great deal more than the small story they had agreed to tell. Do not wait for a room to hand that knowledge to you. Rooms are slow. Rooms are almost always the very last to know. So stand however you have earned the right to stand, whether or not anybody in the room is able to read it on you. And if you ever find yourself out at the edge of some party, holding your quiet in your hand like a smooth, heavy stone, remember that the quiet is a tool and not a wound, and that the people who truly matter will recognize you in the end, and that the rest of them, the ones who laughed, were never really looking in the first place. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of it. I am glad, more than I can easily say, that you were here.